Usually when you talk about a royal family, there's this built-in expectation of a grand destiny.
Right, like an inevitable march of history.
Exactly. It's presented as if it was all preordained by divine right. You look at a map, you see a massive empire, and the history books just point and say, well, there it is. They were chosen by history to rule.
I mean, it's the illusion of inevitability. When you look at the final borders of a unified nation, it's very easy to just assume the people who drew those borders were always meant to be the architects.
It's clean, it's monumental. But then you look at the House of Savoy, and suddenly that whole grand destiny narrative just shatters into a million pieces.
No, completely. It is incredibly messy.
The historical arc we are looking at today in this deep dive is, well, it's wild. I want you to imagine a family that starts out as obscure, glorified toll keepers freezing in the Alpine mountain passes in the year 1003.
Right, with basically nothing.
Yeah, they have no empire, no grand army. But they somehow maneuver, claw, and scheme their way into becoming the kings of a unified Italy centuries later.
Only to end up completely exiled, like explicitly banned from their own country by their own constitution.
And literally throwing physical punches at a modern royal wedding in the 2000s.
It is the absolute definition of a dynastic roller coaster.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We've been going through a mountain of sources for this deep dive, articles from The Collector, Learn Emo, the AHA, the Irish delegation of the dynastic orders of the House of Savoy, plus a ton of historical data from Wikipedia, just to really get to the bottom of this.
There's a lot of material to synthesize, yeah.
It is. Our mission here is to uncover the central historical tension of this entire dynasty. How did they gain power through some of the most brilliant, ruthless opportunism in European history?
And how did they legitimize that power by riding the wave of Italian nationalism, right?
Exactly. And ultimately, how did they engineer their own spectacular ruin?
To really pull this apart, we need to view their history through two distinct lenses. I'll be focusing heavily on the geopolitical chess moves, the institutional survival tactics, and the hard statecraft.
And I'm going to be focusing on the family's intense internal dynamics, their relentless myth-making, and the incredibly complicated, sometimes very dark cultural legacy they left behind.
It's a perfect split.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how a family loses an entire kingdom in 1946, we can't start at the end. We have to look at how they acquired their first ounce of power.
By literally guarding the gates of Europe in the 11th century.
The year is a little 1103. And the founder of this dynasty steps onto the historical stage, a guy named Humbert the White-Handed.
Just the name alone, I mean.
Right, it sounds like a character from a high fantasy novel. But when you dig into who he actually was, the records are fascinatingly murky.
They are. Very unclear origins.
Was he Teutonic? Was he from Saxony? Modern investigations point toward the county of Vienne, where he and his relatives held possessions. But I'm obsessed with this nickname. White-handed.
It functions as an incredible branding exercise, whether it was intentional at the time or, applied later by his descendants.
I mean, was it because he had pale skin? Were his hands literally covered in alpine snow? Some historians suggest it was just a mistranslation of the white walls of his castle.
Which is entirely plausible.
Or, and this is my favorite theory because it fits everything else this family does later, it was a manufactured myth. If you are a rugged mountain warlord, calling yourself white-handed implies this sense of purity, nobility, and justice.
They definitely love their PR.
The Savoy family loved to invent their own mythology to sound far more ancient and important than they actually were.
Well, the mythology is interesting, but Humbert's actual tangible power was entirely grounded in shrewd, pragmatic politics. You have to look at the map of Europe in the early 11th century.
It was a mess, right?
A total mess. The old Carolingian Empire had completely fallen apart. The Kingdom of Burgundy is splintering into pieces. It's an era of massive fragmentation. And in the middle of this chaos, Humbert makes a highly calculated move.
What does he do?
He steps up and pledges his absolute, unwavering loyalty to the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II.
And why on earth does Conrad II care about this random guy in the mountains?
Because Conrad II desperately needs someone reliable to secure the Alpine passes. We are talking about the Great St. Bernard Pass, the Simplon Pass, Mount Cenis.
These aren't just scenic hiking routes.
No, not at all. These are the critical geographical arteries connecting the wealth of northern Italy to the military and political heartlands of France and Germany.
So if you want to move an army, or if you want to move trade goods, or even if pilgrims want to travel to Rome, they literally have to go through those specific choke points in the Alps.
Precisely the mechanism of his power. By giving Humbert control of these passes, Conrad II was essentially handing him the keys to the continent's back door.
Wow.
The Savoys in this era weren't a military superpower. They didn't have a giant standing army. They were simply the gatekeepers.
It makes me think of a modern tech startup that manages to patent a tiny, hyper-specific piece of code, like a code that Apple, Google, and Microsoft all fundamentally need in order for their systems to run.
That is a great way to look at it.
The Savoy family didn't need to be the biggest empire on the map. They just needed to own the road between the giants and charge a toll.
And that analogy holds up perfectly when you look at how they leveraged that position. Because they controlled that critical infrastructure, they became indispensable to the larger empires.
So they traded geographical leverage for legitimate titles.
Exactly. In 1035, Humbert actually launches an attack on the city of Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne. And why? Just to punish a local bishop who refused to pay homage to the Holy Roman Emperor.
He's acting as the emperor's enforcer.
Yes, and his reward for that violence is being named Count of Maurienne, which eventually morphs into the title of Count of Savoy.
So they've secured their patent, they've got their initial funding and titles. But I have to ask, at this early stage, did the Savoy family actually have a national identity?
What do you mean?
Like, were they sitting around a fire feeling Italian or French? Or were they just, mercenaries working for whoever gave them the best deal?
Oh, the concept of a national identity in the 11th century simply didn't exist for these nobles in the way we understand it today.
Really? Just pure pragmatism?
Absolutely. They were purely pragmatic feudal lords. Their loyalty was to their dynasty, their immediate territory, and their own survival. Culturally, they operated in a borderland region where French, Italian, and Arpitan dialects completely blurred together.
Which brings up a massive problem for any startup, or in this case, a feudal dynasty. You have this incredibly valuable territory, these mountain passes. How do you stop your hard-won territory from being broken into pieces every time a count dies?
Yes, because leaving land to multiple children was the norm.
Right.
This is the central crisis of feudal inheritance. In many systems, land was divided among heirs, which slowly diluted a family's power over generations. To stop this, Amadeus V introduces the Salic law of succession to the Savoy domains,
banning women from inheriting the title or the land.
Yes. And from a modern perspective, it is a glaringly exclusionary practice. But you have to view it through the lens of medieval institutional survival.
Okay, how so?
Well, medieval territories function somewhat like easily splintered corporate shares. If a female heir inherited a chunk of Savoy land and then married a rival duke from France or Austria, that rival house would suddenly own a piece of the Alpine passes.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
The Salic law was a brutal, pragmatic mechanism to ensure the territory remained whole and exclusively in the hands of the Savoy bloodline.
It was a preservation tactic. Lock down the shares so no hostile takeovers can happen via marriage.
Exactly.
And once they secured the borders and the inheritance, they started focusing heavily on their brand. We see this brilliantly with Amadeus VI in the 14th century.
Ah, yes. The Green Count.
Right. He is famously known as the Green Count.
He was highly effective territorially, even purchasing vast areas in the Western Alps and expanding their footprint into northern Italy.
But the way he did it was pure theatrical genius. I mean, he was called the Green Count because he turned his entire life into a branding exercise for the color green.
It was quite literally everywhere.
He wore green armor, his knights wore green tunics, his horses had green trappings. He threw these massive, incredibly expensive, colorful, chivalric tournaments.
It wasn't just an eccentric fashion choice, though.
No, this wasn't just a guy with a favorite color. He was using pageantry as a weapon.
Soft power.
Yes. He was signaling to the ancient, established royal houses of Europe, look at us. We aren't just rugged toll-keepers scraping a living off the snow anymore. We have immense wealth. We have high culture. We have a chivalric prestige.
He was taking their new money and wrapping it in old world symbolism to legitimize their presence on the European stage.
And that pragmatic adaptation transforming from rugged gatekeepers into wealthy, cultured nobles was essential for what was coming.
Because the geopolitical landscape of Europe was about to shift dramatically. The era of just sitting in the mountains and collecting tolls had a very short shelf life.
The giants around them were waking up.
Exactly. The 15th through 18th centuries marked an era of massive consolidation. Europe was forming into centralized nation-states.
Like France and Spain.
Right. Primarily the Kingdom of France and the Spanish Empire, who were locked in a constant, violent struggle for dominance over the Italian peninsula. And the Savoys were geographically trapped right in the crossfire.
And their immediate reaction to this changing world is just is bizarre. We have to talk about Amadeus VIII.
Oh, this is a fascinating pivot.
In 1416, the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund elevates the family. He promotes them from counts to dukes. So Amadeus VIII is the very first Duke of Savoy. That is a massive promotion.
A huge deal for their legitimacy.
But then toward the end of his life, he gets involved in the Western Schism of the Catholic Church.
The Western Schism was a period of profound crisis for the Church, where you literally had multiple men claiming to be the true pope simultaneously, excommunicating each other and dividing the loyalties of Europe's monarchs.
And Amadeus VIII, this newly minted Duke of Savoy, looks at this absolute theological chaos and says, I'll take a piece of that.
He really did.
In 1439, a rogue council, the Council of Basel, actually elects him as the pope. Or, well, anti-Pope Felix V, because there was already a recognized pope sitting in Rome. He reigns as a rogue pope for 10 years.
It seems absurd on the surface, but you have to look at the mechanics of why a duke would do this.
Wait, there was a logical reason for this?
Very much so. The Council of Basel needed a wealthy, secular figurehead to give their movement financial backing and military protection. Amadeus VIII saw an opportunity to gain unprecedented religious and political leverage.
Oh, I see.
By holding the title of Pope, even a disputed one, he made himself a central figure in European diplomacy.
It's just the sheer audacity of it. A couple of centuries ago, his ancestors are charging a few coins to let merchants cross a bridge in the snow. Now, one of their guys is wearing the papal tiara, directly challenging the authority of Rome.
It's the ultimate dynastic flex.
But that flex couldn't save them from the physical realities of their geography, right?
No, it really couldn't. While they were playing church politics, the real existential threat was marching toward their borders. France.
Yes. In 1536, King Francis I of France invades Savoy and Piedmont. France has centralized its military, and the Savoy simply cannot withstand the sheer force of a modernizing national army.
They just get steamrolled.
Completely. The Duke at the time, Charles III, is completely routed. He actually has to flee. The family loses almost all their ancestral lands. It legitimately looked like the House of Savoy was going to be wiped off the map forever.
But they don't die out. They bounce back through a guy named Emmanuel Philibert, and he comes with another fantastic nickname, Ironhead.
Emmanuel Philibert is arguably the most consequential figure in their early modern history. Since he doesn't have an army or a state of his own anymore, he offers his services to the Spanish, who are the bitter, wealthy rivals of the French.
Smart move.
He becomes a brilliant military commander for the Spanish forces. His battlefield successes are so crucial that when the great powers finally sit down to negotiate the Peace of controversies in 1559, he is able to demand the return of his family's duchy. He gets his lands back. But what fascinates me is that he doesn't just go back home, sit in his ancestral castle in France, and pretend the invasion never happened.
Not all.
He recognizes a fundamental truth about his family's position.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he executes a tectonic institutional pivot. Emmanuel Philibert looks at the map and realizes France has simply become too powerful, too centralized.
They're a brick wall.
Exactly. If the Savoys keep their center of gravity on the French side of the Alps, in Chambéry, they will eventually be swallowed whole. But when he looks south, over the mountains to the Italian peninsula, he sees weakness.
A patchwork of fragmented, divided, wealthy little city-states.
So he literally packs up the entire royal court, crosses the Alps, and moves the capital to Turin in Italy.
And he doesn't just change the address. He officially makes Italian the language of his administration.
He fundamentally alters the cultural DNA of his dynasty to ensure their survival. By moving to Turin, they officially detach themselves from the French sphere of influence and declare themselves an Italian power.
It was a defensive survival mechanism that brilliantly laid the groundwork for an aggressive expansionist strategy.
And nobody played that expansionist strategy better or more ruthlessly than Victor Emmanuel II during the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century.
Oh, this guy was the ultimate political chameleon.
The War of the Spanish Succession was a massive global conflict. It primarily pitted the Bourbons of France against the Habsburgs of Austria over who would inherit the Spanish Empire.
And right in the middle of this clash of titans is Victor Amadeus II's territory of Piedmont. He starts the war allied with the French, right? He's deeply tied to them.
Yes. Two of his daughters are literally married to grandsons of the French king, Louis XIV.
So he is entirely embedded in the French alliance network.
But Victor Amadeus realizes a terrifying reality. Louis XIV doesn't view him as a partner. He views him as a speed bump.
Ouch.
The French are slowly trying to envelop his territory and turn the Duchy of Savoy into a mere vassal state, stripping away his autonomy.
So what is his solution? He commits one of the most perfectly timed betrayals in European history.
In 1703, he secretly opens backdoor diplomatic channels with the Habsburgs. It is incredibly dangerous.
Because if the French find out, he's dead.
Right. He uses a delay tactics, playing both sides, assuring the French of his loyalty while negotiating the exact price of his defection with the Austrians. When he finally switches his allegiance, the French are furious.
I can imagine.
They march in and lay a brutal siege to his new capital, Turin, in 1706.
But Victor Amadeus, with the help of his brilliant cousin, Prince Eugene of Savoy, manages to break the siege. They absolutely crush the French forces.
And the reward for this magnificent, treacherous gamble is exactly what the family had been chasing for 700 years.
The crown.
At the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the great powers reward his strategic defection by granting him the Kingdom of Sicily.
The Dukes of Savoy are finally officially kings.
He later is forced by geopolitical pressure to trade Sicily for the Kingdom of Sardinia in 1720, which is slightly less prestigious, but the vital permanent threshold has been crossed.
They are now the kings of Sardinia, ruling over Savoy, Piedmont, and the island.
Exactly.
You know, this entire strategy of playing the giants against each other, taking a little piece of land here, a little island there, brings up a metaphor from the AHA historical records that perfectly captures their mindset.
The artichoke metaphor.
Yes, it says, to the rulers of Piedmont, Italy was an artichoke to be swallowed leaf by leaf.
The artichoke protocol. It's an incredibly apt description of their statecraft.
I want you to really visualize this for a second. Think about eating an artichoke. You don't just take a massive bite out of the center, you choke on it.
Right, it's too tough.
You have to be patient. You peel off one leaf at a time, you scrape off a tiny bit of meat, you discard the rest, and you slowly, methodically work your way toward the heart.
That was the House of Savoy.
They didn't have a grand unifying ideology at this point. They weren't fighting to liberate the Italian people. They just had a relentless patient appetite.
It was dynastic aggrandizement in its purest form. They fought a war, grabbed a sliver of land, a single leaf. They waited a generation, consolidated their administration, fought another war, and grabbed another leaf.
Slowly eating their way across the map of northern Italy over centuries.
But as we transition into the 19th century, that careful, patient strategy completely breaks down.
Well, yeah, you can't just sit at the table quietly peeling leaves when the entire artichoke suddenly catches on fire.
The rules of the game changed overnight. The French Revolution detonates, followed by the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and a massive wave of European nationalism.
And this is terrifying for them. The Savoys are an absolute monarchy. Their entire right to rule is based on bloodlines and divine right.
Suddenly, right next door in France, people are chopping off their king's head in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
It is an existential nightmare for the House of Savoy.
And it becomes a physical nightmare when Napoleon's armies sweep into northern Italy. The French completely dismantle the old feudal structures.
They bring in the modern world, essentially.
Yes, they introduce the Napoleonic civil code, modern administration, and meritocracy. The Savoy king is utterly defeated and forced to flee all the way to the island of Sardinia.
Surviving only because the British Navy is protecting the Mediterranean.
Right.
So they spend years on this island, fuming. When Napoleon is finally defeated and the Congress of Vienna restores the old borders in 1815, putting the Savoys back on their throne in Turin, their reaction is almost comical in its denial.
King Victor Emmanuel III tries to pretend none of it happened.
He actually tries to turn the clock back to 1788. He systematically tries to abolish every single reform the French introduced. He fires anyone who worked for the French administration. He wants to go back to ruling like a medieval lord.
But the societal architecture had fundamentally changed. You cannot force people who have tasted modern legal systems, efficient bureaucracy, and the initial sparks of a national consciousness back into feudal subservience.
The genie is out of the bottle.
Exactly. The intellectual elite, the merchant classes, the secret societies, they were deeply influenced by Romantic nationalism. This is the gestation period of the Risorgimento, the movement for Italian unification.
The pressure cooker's building. And the main branch of the Savoy family actually goes extinct in 1831 with Charles Felix. The crown passes to a junior branch of the family, the Savoy Caryanos, specifically to a man named Charles Albert.
And Charles Albert is forced to navigate a completely unprecedented crisis. By 1848, the pressure cooker explodes.
1838 was a crazy year for Europe.
A massive wave of popular revolutions sweeps across the entirety of Europe. Citizens are manning barricades in Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. Crucially, uprisings break out in Milan and Venice, which are currently under the harsh control of the Austrian Empire.
The people in the streets aren't asking for different kings. They're demanding written constitutions, democratic parliaments, and a unified Italian republic. They want to tear down the monarchies entirely.
Facing this intense, potentially fatal pressure from his own people, Charles Albert does something that seems completely out of character for an absolute monarch.
He enacts the Statuto Albertino.
Yes, a liberal constitution for his kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. It legally recognizes a two-chamber parliament, guarantees basic civil rights, and limits his own absolute power.
But let's look at the mechanics of why he did this. When you read the private letters and the historical analyses, it's abundantly clear he didn't do this because he suddenly had an epiphany and fell in love with democracy.
Not in the slightest. It was a cold, deeply calculated institutional maneuver.
He was protecting his neck.
Charles Albert saw that democratic Republican forces, led by passionate radical figures like Giuseppe Mazzini, were gaining massive traction among the populace. If Mazzini and the Republicans took leadership of the unification movement and successfully drove out the Austrians, the House of Savoy would be viewed as an archaic obstacle and swept into the dustbin of history.
So by granting a constitution, he deflates the revolutionary tension at home. And by immediately declaring war on Austria to supposedly support the rebels in Milan, he effectively co-opts the entire revolution.
He essentially hijacks the patriotic narrative. His message to the Italian revolutionaries was, you want to fight the Austrian Empire and unify Italy, fine, but you don't have the military logistics to do it.
We are doing it under my flag, funded by my treasury, and I will be the constitutional king at the end of it.
Exactly. His military campaign against the Austrians actually fails miserably, and he has to abdicate. But his political maneuver is a masterstroke. He lays the foundation for his son, Victor Emmanuel II, to finish the job.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is where the Savoy family executes one of the greatest PR campaigns in human history. Victor Emmanuel II, working with his brilliant prime minister, Count Cavour, realizes they can't beat Austria alone.
Cavour's diplomacy is the true engine of unification. He understands that Italian passion isn't enough. They need a superpower on their side.
So he orchestrates a secret agreement with the French Emperor, Napoleon III, at Plombières.
The deal is simple. Piedmont will provoke Austria into declaring war. France will intervene to help Piedmont crush the Austrians. And in exchange, Piedmont will cede their ancestral homelands of Savoy and Nice to France.
They literally traded away the snowy mountain passes where their family began just to secure the northern half of Italy.
It was a massive sacrifice for a greater prize.
Meanwhile, down in the south, you have Giuseppe Garibaldi, a radical, charismatic Republican leading a volunteer army of red shirts. He conquers the entire kingdom of the two Sicilies in the south.
This creates an incredibly volatile moment. Garibaldi holds the south, the king holds the north. Garibaldi is a Republican who despises monarchy.
But the pragmatism wins out. It culminates in this legendary, highly romanticized moment in October 1860, the handshake at Tiano. Garibaldi rides up to Victor Emmanuel II, shakes his hand, hands over the entire southern half of the peninsula, and formally addresses him as King of Italy. By March 1861, the artichoke is fully swallowed.
The House of Savoy has unified Italy. They rebrand themselves from ambitious, opportunistic land grabbers into the fathers of the fatherland.
The narrative they built around themselves as the destined saviors of Italy was incredibly robust. But I want to push back really hard on that romantic narrative.
How so?
Because when you look at the actual mechanics of how this new country was built, the Risorgimento doesn't look like a joyful brotherhood of Italians coming together. It looks exactly like a hostile corporate takeover by Piedmont.
Well, the administrative integration was certainly fraught.
Fraught is a polite word for it. Piedmont didn't facilitate the creation of a new collaborative Italian state. They simply expanded their own borders and forced their own systems onto everyone else.
They did apply their systems rather directly.
They took Charles Albert's constitution, the Statuto Albertino, and just applied it to the whole peninsula. They imposed Piedmontese laws, their specific taxation systems, and their northern administrators on southern regions like Naples and Sicily.
It was very top-down.
They completely ignored the distinct regional identities, languages, and agrarian economies of the South. They treated southern Italy like a newly conquered colony extracting wealth to pay off the massive debts Piedmont incurred fighting the Unification Wars.
I hear you. The policy of Piedmontization caused deep structural resentment, leading to widespread brigandage and a virtual civil war in the South that lasted for years.
It was brutal.
However, we have to look at the harsh geopolitical reality of the mid-19th century. While it functioned as a hostile takeover, Piedmont was literally the only Italian state with the institutional machinery capable of pulling it off.
You mean the military?
I mean, the entire apparatus is a modern state. Piedmont was the only state with a functional, centralized bureaucracy, a credit-worthy financial structure, a disciplined standing army, and the diplomatic weight to sit at the table with empires.
Okay, that's fair.
The passionate Republicans in the South could inspire a crowd, but they could not negotiate the complex international treaties required to keep France and Britain complacent while they dismantled the Austrian presence in the North.
So they needed the Savoys.
Yes. Without the ruthless, heavy-handed pragmatism of the House of Savoy forcing the pieces together, Italy remains exactly what the Austrian Chancellor Metternich famously sneered it was, merely a geographic expression.
I see the structural necessity. They were the only ones who could afford to build the car. But as we move into the late 19th century, we quickly see that building the vehicle and knowing how to drive it without crashing are two very different things.
We enter a period where the crown begins to seriously fracture under the weight of its own creation.
They swallowed the artichoke, but the digestion process was agonizing. Ruling a unified Italy proved far more difficult than conquering it.
The institutional flaws of the new kingdom became glaringly apparent. The parliamentary system established by that imposed constitution was incredibly fragile.
And corrupt.
Deeply corrupt political factions plagued the system. And crucially, it lacked true democratic representation. In the early years of unification, the franchise was restricted by wealth and literacy tests. Less than 2% of the population could actually vote.
So you have a government that doesn't actually represent the millions of peasants and emerging industrial workers it is governing.
Exactly. Add to that severe, grinding economic hardship. The heavy taxation imposed to build northern infrastructure devastated the southern agrarian economy.
While in the industrializing North, the working classes were facing abysmal conditions.
And on top of domestic miseries, the government attempted to boost its prestige by engaging in a disastrous colonial adventure in Africa. The First Italo-Ethiopian War ended in a catastrophic, humiliating defeat for the Italian army at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. The international prestige of the state was shattered, which only emboldened domestic unrest.
Which brings us to the reign of King Umberto III, and specifically to the spring of 1898. This is the moment where the benevolent mask of the monarchy just completely slips off.
It's had a very dark turn.
The cost of wheat has skyrocketed globally. People in Italy are literally starving. In Milan, citizens take to the streets to protest the exorbitant price of bread. It starts as an angry, spontaneous bread riot.
A visceral eruption of economic desperation.
And how does the Savoy state respond to its starving citizens? King Umberto's government declares a state of siege. They send in General Fiorenzo Bava Beccaris.
And he doesn't just send in police with batons to clear the square.
No. He brings in the military, he brings in artillery, he orders his troops to fire literal cannons into crowds of unarmed civilians in the streets of a modern European city.
It's horrifying.
Hundreds of people are slaughtered. Thousands are arrested, including journalists and political opponents who had nothing to do with the riots.
The Bava Beccaris massacre is a definitive rupture in modern Italian history. It laid bare the state's willingness to use extreme, mechanized violence against its own citizens to maintain the social order of the elite.
But the violence isn't even the most shocking part to me. It's the cultural and dynastic fallout. After the blood is washed off the cobblestones, King Umberto doesn't fire the general.
No, he does the exact opposite.
He doesn't issue a royal apology to the city of Milan. He actually decorates General Bava Beccaris. He sends him a telegram and awards him the Great Cross of the Order of Savoy, praising his service to civilization.
The official language of the telegram thanked the general for the great service rendered to our institutions and to civilization.
It is breathtaking, almost suicidal arrogance. It shows a complete disconnect from the reality of the 20th century. The House of Savoy forgot they were supposed to be ruling a modern nation of citizens with rights.
They reverted to their roots?
Exactly. In that moment, Umberto was acting exactly like his medieval ancestor, Humbert the White-Handed, violently putting down a peasant revolt in an Alpine valley. He thought he could just shoot his way out of a complex socioeconomic crisis.
And that arrogance generated a direct, fatal consequence. The brutality in Milan resonated far beyond the borders of Italy, radicalizing those who saw the monarchy as a violent oppressor.
It resonated all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Paterson, New Jersey.
A young Italian immigrant and anarchist named Gaetano Bresci was working in America. He reads the international news about the massacre in Milan, and he specifically reads about King Umberto pilling a medal on the general who ordered the artillery fire.
Bresci is so enraged by the sheer injustice of it that he buys a ticket, gets on a ship, sails all the way back across the Atlantic,
Yeah.
tracks down King Umberto in the city of Monza on July 29, 1900, and shoots him dead.
This assassination is the first massive structural fracture in the Savoy's legitimacy. While the constitutional transition of power to Umberto's son occurred smoothly, the moral authority of the crown was hemorrhaging.
They were losing the people.
For a massive segment of the working class and the peasantry, the monarchy was no longer the heroic unifying force of the Risorgimento. It was a violent, out-of-touch opponent.
That loss of moral authority, combined with a deep, paralyzing fear of the angry masses, is the direct prelude to the darkest chapter in the history of the House of Savoy. It paves the exact path to their ultimate downfall.
We have arrived at the defining crisis, the fatal handshake, the years 1922 to 1946.
King Victor Emmanuel III takes the throne after his father is murdered. The sources describe him as a physically slight, deeply hesitant ruler, a man who preferred to stay in the background and collect coins rather than govern.
But his one major political intervention destroyed his family's legacy forever.
The crisis reaches a boiling point in October 1922. Italy is reeling from the economic and psychological devastation of World War I.
There is severe instability, violent clashes in the streets between socialist workers and right-wing paramilitary groups, and a deep sense of national humiliation regarding the post-war treaties.
And Benito Mussolini and his fascist movement decide to capitalize on this chaos. They organize the March on Rome.
A mass demonstration of armed fascist black shirts threatening to seize the government by force.
It's a literal armed insurrection marching on the capital.
The liberal government in Rome panics. The prime minister, Luigi Facta, drafts a decree for martial law. He is ready to deploy the royal army to crush the fascists.
And militarily, they could have, right?
Oh, absolutely. From a military standpoint, the army is loyal, well-equipped, and easily outguns Mussolini's disorganized thugs. Facta just needs King Victor Emmanuel III to fulfill his constitutional duty and sign the decree.
And the king refuses. He completely loses his nerve and refuses to sign it. Prime Minister Facta resigns in despair, and the king essentially hands the keys to the government over to Mussolini, inviting him to form a cabinet.
This raises an important question, and it's perhaps the most heavily debated decision in modern Italian history. Why did he refuse to use the military to defend the constitutional government?
What are the mechanics behind that refusal? Did he genuinely believe the fascists would win a fight?
Victor Emmanuel III later claimed his refusal was an act of mercy. He argued he wanted to avoid plunging Italy into a bloody civil war, prioritizing Italian lives over political maneuvering.
But historians don't really buy that, do they?
No. Deeper institutional analysis reveals a much more cynical calculus. The king was absolutely terrified of the socialists and the communists, who had been organizing massive, paralyzing strikes and actively calling for the abolition of the monarchy.
He's looking over his shoulder at history.
Exactly. He looked at the fate of his own father, assassinated by an anarchist. He looked at the Romanovs in Russia, recently executed in a basement by the Bolsheviks.
So he chose what he thought was the lesser evil.
Many historians argue he saw Mussolini not as an existential threat to the state, but as a blunt, useful tool, a way to violently crush the left-wing revolutionaries, restore harsh social order, and most importantly, preserve the House of Savoy on the throne.
It's the artichoke strategy all over again, just terribly miscalculated. He thought he could use Mussolini, swallow that fascist leaf, use their violence to clean up the streets, and stay in control.
But he ended up being swallowed by the monster he invited in.
By refusing to sign that decree, he compromised the fundamental integrity of the constitutional monarchy. He legally sanctioned a violent takeover, and in doing so, he made the House of Savoy completely, legally complicit in everything the fascist regime did for the next 2 decades.
And that complicity reaches its absolute moral nadir in 1938.
This is the stain on the family's legacy that can never be washed out. In 1938, Mussolini introduces the racial laws, heavily mirroring the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany.
These laws stripped Italian Jews of their basic civil rights, banned them from public office, universities, and professions.
As the constitutional monarch, Victor Emmanuel III had to formally sign those laws for them to take effect.
He rubber-stamped them.
He didn't protest, he didn't use his influence to stop them, he didn't abdicate in protest, he just signed his name.
It was a devastating failure of leadership.
There's a specific detail from the historical archives that just haunts me. When the Shalom publication from the Jewish community of Rome commented on this period years later, they highlighted the supreme personal betrayal of this act.
What did they point out?
They pointed out that dozens of Jewish officers had fought fiercely for the king in World War I. They had bled in the trenches for the House of Savoy. They had been awarded medals of military valor for their bravery.
Wow.
And with a single stroke of his pen, the king allowed those exact same loyal veterans to be expelled from the royal army, stripped of their dignity, and eventually deported to death camps.
That is deeply tragic.
It wasn't just a failure of abstract statecraft, it was a profound personal betrayal of subjects who had sworn their lives to protect him.
It was a total abdication of the basic moral duty of a sovereign to protect their people. And the consequences of this moral rot inevitably played out on the military and institutional stage as well.
It all falls apart.
If we jump forward to the summer of 1943, the Second World War has become a total catastrophe for Italy. The Allies have landed in Sicily, the Italian army is broken, and the country is facing absolute ruin.
So the king, in a desperate 11th-hour attempt to save his throne from the wreckage, finally decides to act against Mussolini.
He supports a vote of no confidence, has the dictator arrested, and signs the Armistice of Cassibile with the Allies.
But even when he does the right thing, he manages to execute it in the most disastrous way possible.
The German army, enraged by the secret armistice, immediately begins rapidly advancing down the peninsula to occupy Italy and seize Rome.
As the Germans approach the capital, Victor Emmanuel III and his new government make a decision that sealed their fate. They secretly flee Rome in the middle of the night and head for the Allied-controlled territory in the south.
It was a very controversial departure.
That is an incredibly polite way of framing it. Let's call it what it was. In an act of supreme cowardice, he packed his bags and ran.
Well, from a certain perspective, yes.
He left the entire Italian military without clear orders, without a command structure, and he abandoned the citizens of Rome, including the Jewish population he had already betrayed, to the mercy of the occupying Nazis. It shattered whatever tiny, lingering illusion of royal duty was left in the country.
I will respectfully push back on that characterization purely from an institutional perspective.
Okay, let's hear it.
The execution of the flight was undeniably botched, and the optics were catastrophic for morale. But many constitutional and military historians argue that fleeing Rome was a cold institutional necessity.
How can abandoning your capital be a necessity?
Because the king is the physical embodiment of the legal state. If the king is captured by the Germans and forced to sign a surrender or a new alliance, the Italian state ceases to exist as an independent legal entity.
Oh, I see the logic there.
The Allies would have no legitimate Italian government to negotiate with, rendering Italy a completely conquered territory rather than a co-belligerent. Fleeing south, while cowardly in a personal sense, ensured the legal continuity of the government.
I understand the legal bureaucratic argument, I really do. But a monarchy relies on more than just legal continuity and paperwork.
It relies on symbolism.
Yes, it relies on a mystical bond, a shared identity, and shared sacrifice with the people. When the father of the fatherland abandons his children to the wolves just to save his own skin and his legal status, that bond is broken forever.
It's hard to recover from that.
You can't just come back after the war, wave to the crowds and say, hey, it was a strategic withdrawal for legal continuity.
And the Italian populace entirely agreed with your assessment. In the aftermath of World War II, the country was traumatized, deeply divided, and intensely disaffected with the monarchy.
The king's early support for fascism, his signing of the racial laws, and his fight from Rome were deemed unforgivable by a majority of the population.
So we arrive at June 6, 1946, the national referendum on the institutional future of the state.
Victor Emmanuel III realizes his personal brand is completely toxic. So in May, just weeks before the critical vote, he desperately abdicates in favor of his son, Umberto II.
He hopes that putting a fresh face on the throne, someone less directly tied to the fascist era, might sway the voters and save the monarchy.
Umberto II becomes known as the May King because he reigned for exactly 1 month.
Because on June 2, the results of the referendum are decisive. Around 54% of Italians voted to replace the monarchy with a republic.
It's fascinating how the vote was split, though.
It was heavily regional. The conservative agrarian South, which had been spared the worst of the Nazi occupation and the vicious civil war of the resistance, largely voted to keep the king.
Right.
But the center and the industrialized North, which had suffered brutally under the German occupation and felt the deepest betrayal of the king's flight, voted overwhelmingly to abolish the monarchy.
And with that vote, the 1,000-year run is over. On June 13th, Umberto II and his wife quietly go into exile.
The constitutional era of the Savoy is finished.
And the new Italian constitution is written with a very specific, very pointed clause. All male members of the House of Savoy and their wives are permanently banned from ever setting foot on Italian soil again.
The physical presence of the dynasty that literally drew the borders of the nation was legally excised from it.
You would think that's the end of the story, right?
Yeah.
A tragic but dignified fade into the history books. An exiled royal family living quietly in a villa in Switzerland or Portugal, mourning their lost kingdom and reflecting on their mistakes.
No.
The House of Savoy does not do quiet dignity. Instead, they turn their exile into a modern tragicomedy.
We enter the era of the modern soap opera.
The constitutional ban on the family was finally lifted in 2002. The Italian Republic felt secure enough to allow them to return as private citizens. But instead of a quiet, respectful return, the controversies just exploded onto the front pages of the tabloids.
The family itself had fractured deeply during their exile over the theoretical question of who was the rightful head of the house.
Two competing factions.
You had the legitimists who supported Vittorio Emmanuele, the son of the last king, and you had the Aostes who supported his cousin, Prince Amedeo of Savoy-Aosta, arguing that Vittorio Emmanuele had forfeited his rights through an unapproved marriage.
And this wasn't just a polite, scholarly disagreement between gentlemen over tea. In 2004, at a massive royal wedding in Spain for the current King Felipe, Vittorio Emmanuele actually confronts his cousin Prince Amedeo and punches him in the face.
Twice. At a royal wedding.
The deposed king of Greece had to catch Amedeo so he wouldn't fall backward down the stairs. They had to be physically separated. It's like a scene from a trashy reality TV show, not the behavior of a 1,000-year-old dynasty.
Beyond the sheer indignity of the physical altercations, there were incredibly audacious legal maneuvers that demonstrated how out of touch they remained.
Right. After returning to Italy, Vittorio Emanuele and his son, Emanuele Filiberto, actually had the nerve to sue the Italian state.
They demanded financial compensation.
They wanted 170 million euros in damages for the moral and financial hardship of their years in exile. Furthermore, they demanded the return of the Italian crown jewels, which had been locked in a Bank of Italy vault since 1946.
From an institutional standpoint, it shows a profound, staggering lack of self-awareness. To demand hundreds of millions of euros in damages from a republic that your family's complicity with fascism helped destroy, it struck the Italian public as incredibly entitled and tone-deaf.
The government immediately rejected the claim, stating they owed the Savoys nothing, and arguably the Savoys owed Italy reparations.
It was a massive PR disaster that reopened all the old wounds.
Now, to be completely fair to the narrative, Vittorio Emanuele's son, Emanuele Filiberto, who is a bit of a TV personality in Italy now, participating in dancing shows and selling pasta from food trucks, did try to repair some of the historical damage.
Yes, the apology.
In 2021, ahead of Holocaust Memorial Day, he wrote a formal public letter apologizing to the Jewish community for his great-grandfather signing the 1938 racial laws. He stated that he condemned the laws unconditionally and felt the heavy moral weight of them on his shoulders.
But the response from the Jewish community was highly critical and measured. They essentially deemed it too little, too late.
That makes sense.
They noted the family's decades-long reluctance to fully and clearly acknowledge their role in the Holocaust prior to this PR move. The timing, over 80 years after the fact, felt entirely insufficient to erase such a profound institutional and moral failure.
It just highlights how permanent the stain on their cultural legacy really is. You can't just hire a crisis PR firm and issue an apology letter to wipe away that kind of historical betrayal.
And yet, despite the loss of the throne, despite the endless modern scandals, and despite having zero actual political power, the family's obsession with their internal dynastic rules continues unabated.
Which brings us to the ultimate irony of the modern era. We have to circle all the way back to the Salic Law.
Yes. We discussed earlier how Amadeus V introduced the Salic Law centuries ago in the Alps, strictly banning a female succession to keep their feudal territories from being splintered by marriage.
It was the bedrock of their dynastic structure for hundreds of years. It was the rule that governed who held power.
But recently, Vittorio Emmanuel, before his death, looked at his family tree. His son, Emanuele Filiberto, only has daughters. The main line of the family is going to run out of men.
So what does he do? After centuries of ruthlessly enforcing this law, he just decrees a change to the ancient rules.
He abolishes the Salic law entirely to allow his teenage granddaughter, Vittoria, an influencer living in Paris, to enter the line of succession to become the future head of the House of Savoy.
Which, predictably, sparked yet another furious, litigious interfamily feud with the Aosta branch. They claim the decree is entirely illegitimate, that an exiled king cannot change the foundational laws of the house, and that the title of head of the family should rightfully pass to them, as they still have male heirs.
So we have two branches of an exiled family furiously suing each other, throwing punches at weddings, and unilaterally changing thousand-year-old rules over the leadership of a throne that hasn't even existed since 1946.
So what does this all mean? It's the final, desperate move of a dynasty trying to artificially stay relevant in a world that is completely permanently moved on.
If we synthesize this entire thousand-year journey, it really is a fascinating study in the absolute limits of pure pragmatism. The House of Savoy perfectly mastered the geopolitical realities of medieval and early modern Europe.
They knew exactly how to guard an Alpine path.
They knew how to switch alliances at the perfect, treacherous moment to secure a crown. They knew how to swallow the artichoke leaf by leaf to build a nation. They built a magnificent institutional machine that could conquer a peninsula.
But they ultimately failed because they believed that the machine was enough.
Exactly. They couldn't understand or adapt to the moral and democratic realities of the 20th century. Statecraft, when completely decoupled from a moral anchor, ultimately collapses under the weight of its own cynicism.
It makes you really consider how fragile power actually is. You can spend 1,000 years building an empire. You can marry your children into every royal house in Europe. You can fight victorious wars, draft liberal constitutions, and successfully turn your family name into a synonym for a unified nation.
But all of that, a literal millennium of careful, bloody empire building, can be completely, permanently undone by just one generation's cowardice and complicity with tyranny.
History ultimately does not forgive those who abandon their posts when the fire breaks out.
No, it certainly doesn't.
And I want to leave you with one final thought, something to chew on that we haven't touched on yet, but that really lingers with me when I look at the whole picture. When the Italian Republic was born in 1946, they didn't just vote the king out of office.
They wrote a constitution that legally, physically erased the presence of the very family that drew their modern borders and unified their people.
But when a nation decides to legally excise the physical presence of its own architects, what does that do to the country's national memory? Can a country fully understand its own identity, its own structural flaws and historical triumphs when it legally banishes its own founding fathers to the footnotes of history?
It's a profound historical paradox. To save the nation, the architects of the nation had to become its ultimate pariahs.
An artichoke, swallowed leaf by leaf, until nothing but the bitter heart remains. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.